Welcome to Plymouth 400 Conversations. I'm Michele Pecoraro, and I will be your host for this series. The 400th commemoration of our nation has inspired a body of creative work: poetry, film, literature, and art. This series will explore several of these projects and how they contribute to the historic, educational, and cultural legacies of the Plymouth 400 commemoration. In this episode, I'm speaking to Jim Baker, historian and author specializing in the history of the Pilgrims and, in this case, a very famous stone. Jim has written a new book on the Pilgrims entitled Made in America, and a second book that we will discuss about the real history of Plymouth Rock. Jim, welcome to Plymouth 400 Conversations.
Thank you.
From the foreword in Made in America, Richard Pickering writes that you live and breathe the Pilgrim story. Would you tell us about your Pilgrim roots, your professional history, and what led you to write these essays?
Well, having grown up here in Plymouth and been inevitably exposed to the Pilgrims from a young age, as such as accompanying my mother when she was a hostess at the Harlow House, and having a compelling bias towards historical accuracy, I knew the Pilgrim story was full of half-truths and myths that needed to be identified and accounted for. When I was at the plantation, I adopted the motto of all answers questioned here for the plantation research department for that very reason. The influences behind the Pilgrim's traditional depiction had to be analyzed, the evidence for or against evaluated, and everything re-examined if their story was to regain the cultural relevance that had declined over time. Made in America is a result of this approach.
So your book explores the several reasons that Plymouth achieved its historical and symbolic preeminence. Would you talk about those reasons?
Well, the Pilgrim story is not the work of the Plymouth colonists themselves. They only provided the raw material that was worked and reworked by later generations. There was a distinct need at the time of the American Revolution for an inspirational narrative about the providential founding of Puritan New England, and by extension, the new United States. They were not only were the Pilgrims the first English immigrants to New England, but their history was far less controversial than that of Massachusetts Bay or Virginia. Their story, with a little selectivity, could effectively exemplify the personal courage and perseverance, religious toleration, separation of church and state, political equality, the importance of family life, and later Thanksgiving theme, racial harmony.
Very good. The distinction that you draw between Pilgrim and Puritan is most illustrative, and it's something that a lot of people confuse. Would you explain the similarities and differences for our viewers between Pilgrims and Puritans?
Well, it's long been accepted that the Plymouth Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans were two separate cultural species, humane and liberal Pilgrim separatists versus the dour and repressive Massachusetts Puritans. However, that really wasn't the case. Both colonies were Puritan in theology, and while the Massachusetts Bay authorities hung alleged witches and obstreperous Quakers, and Plymouth did not, by the second generation, there were very few appreciable religious or social differences between the two. The opposition was exaggerated by the 19th century Pilgrim advocates who wanted to absolve the Plymouth folks of the negative reputation of Puritans they had acquired, which was due as much to the contemporary identification of Puritanism with Victorian intolerance as it was with any historical reality of 17th century colonial society.
Very good. Thank you for clarifying that for our audience. you write that Americans no longer have a spontaneous collective memory. Can you explain this view and how that might be corrected in the future?
Well, this is the inevitable result of our contemporary recognition and affirmation of cultural diversity. In 1900, the US population was 87% white, and it was their history, presented as beginning with the Pilgrims, that counted. Until after World War II, a single tradition was recognized and celebrated by and large as America's legitimate cultural heritage. Now, today, the population is increasingly ethnically varied, and previously disregarded minority voices are demanding recognition. Whether a new unified history can be developed or promulgated is still a question. However, for the good of the nation, a collective memory, such as once was founded on the Pilgrims, that equitably incorporates the indigenous peoples, the Pilgrims, and other immigrant populations without bias or hierarchy, is greatly to be striven for.
Thank you. Now, your desire in writing this book was to present a nuanced view of what has been taken for granted about the Pilgrims, and to demystify and correct popular misunderstandings of Pilgrim ancestors. From your extensive footnotes and bibliography, it is evident you spent considerable time in researching and writing these essays, and a lifetime of researching and writing as well. Would you talk about your research methods and your writing process?
Yes, like most historians, I find the detective work of ferreting out previously unknown historical details and unrecognized connections immensely gratifying. The labor of composing these facts into coherent form, much less so, but I value being able to share these results, if only to justify the time I've spent in it. When I come across an intriguing subject, I throw myself into accumulating as much information and imagery as possible, buying scads of books, always a good excuse, and ephemera, and now rooting through the internet for weeks at a time. The best way to reduce such a hodgepodge of information into an intelligible shape of my own understanding is to write it out. The resulting books, web pages, and articles are essentially just the byproduct of an insatiable curiosity. There have been immeasurable amounts of ink spent in describing and evaluating the Pilgrim Plymouth colonists, but very little as to how this attention resulted in what I call the Pilgrim story, as opposed to the straight history. I thought it would be illuminating to describe how the colonists became the historical celebrities they did, and by tracing each of these paths to fame, Made in America provides an unusual perspective on this old time-honored subject.
Well, Jim, you are prolific in your expression of history. We're going to take a very short break because we have yet another book that you've written that I know a lot of people are curious about the history of Plymouth Rock. And so in just a minute, we're going to come back and I'm going to interview you about that book as well. Welcome back to Plymouth 400 Conversations. We're here with historian and author Jim Baker. And Jim, we're about to talk about your book about Plymouth Rock, which is a controversial symbol because of its illustrious history. Throughout your professional life, you've displayed a keen interest in Plymouth Colony, of course, and early colonial life. Can you tell us a little bit about your passion for history of this time period?
Well, it's quite true. I have a passion for history. That, together with a relentless curiosity and an aversion to being misinformed, has shaped my career as a researcher and historian. It's also true that I have worked steadily to understand in a highly detailed manner the life and times of Plymouth colonists, their intellectual and material cultures, the historical context in which they are embedded, and anything else that could add to a more accurate comprehension of those famous folk. However, the Pilgrim century is not a period which I would have devoted much time and effort to had not two other factors been true. Having grown up in Plymouth and worked summers for Plymouth Plantation back in the 60s, while in college, I had a reasonable grounding in the subject already. And secondly, when I happened to return to Plymouth after graduate school, a job opened up at the plantation. And that quickly evolved into my becoming responsible for the museum's historical accuracy. I had to master Plymouth's entire colonial history, at least up to 1627 and beyond too, and spared no effort in doing it with a painstaking thoroughness. If at last this did imbue me with a passion for the Pilgrim story, it was to set that story straight and provide the public with a true historical picture.
Very good. Now, about this book, you write about Plymouth Harbor having a good harbor channel for the Mayflower. Why was this a critical feature for choosing Plymouth as a landing site?
Well, if you look out over the harbor at high tide, you think there was a vast expanse that could be freely explored and exploited and utilized. But at low water, however, it's mostly mud flats and shallow dead-end channels. Even the Mayflower could get no further than the entrance to the harbor, but the Pilgrims would rely on ships coming and going from Europe. When the explorers in the Pilgrim shallop first arrived in December 1620, their concern was to sound and measure the depths of the harbor to see if it would be feasible for shipping. What they found was there were very few useful natural channels that could handle ships even at high tide, but there was one usable even during low water. That channel parallels the inner side of Plymouth Beach and then makes a sharp turn just east to connect with the Guzzle, the channel that heads directly to the mainland shore. And it leads right up to Town Brook and Plymouth Rock.
In your book about Plymouth Rock, you referred to its two related histories, archaeological and symbolic. Can you give us a brief understanding of the archaeological history of Plymouth Rock?
Well, geologists have determined that the famous boulder was broken off a ledge somewhere north of Plymouth and deposited here sometime during the Great Laurentide glacial period, about 20,000 years ago. The rock is composed of dedum randorite, a distinctive kind of granite, and it remained untouched on the shore below Coles Hill as a relic of the famous December 11th, 1620 landing that by tradition occurred on that very boulder in 1774. It was then extracted by local patriots, by ox teams, to serve as an icon for the town's independent and patriotic spirit. The rock quietly broke into two halves, which the colonists took as an omen of a peaceful separation from Great Britain. The upper half was dragged then up to Town Square and installed at the foot of a liberty pole near the courthouse.
So, through the years, not unlike the Mayflower Pilgrims, the upper portion of Plymouth Rock has experienced its own unique pilgrimage. Can you talk about the journeys that this rock, this famous stone, has taken?
Well, the upper half is what we know of as Plymouth Rock because we almost never see the lower half. And after the well-known upper segment of the Forefathers, as it was called, of Plymouth Rock was lodged near the townhouse in Town Square, it became the target of souvenir hunters who thought nothing of chipping off pieces for themselves. Alexis de Tocqueville found pieces of the hallowed rock dispersed across the country in the 1830s. To prevent further depredations on the poor old rock, it was moved again on July 4th, 1834, to Pilgrim Hall, where it was protected within a decorative iron fence. In 1880, it was returned to its original location and reunited with its lower half that had been left behind on or in Hedges Wharf. Finally, in 1921, the two, or by then three, sections were fastened together and lowered to sea level beneath the colonial dames funded pillared portico where they remain today. It's quite a career for a simple New England boulder.
Sure is. And you've made mention of Plymouth Rock as having been a mounting dock for the Pilgrims from the Mayflower shallop. Would you explain why this is even plausible?
Well, there's been a perennial dispute as to whether the exploring party actually landed on Plymouth Rock or if it just chose it as a landmark for the landing in the general vicinity. We'll never know the actual answer, but as the critics of the tradition tend to be so very scornful with their common sense rejections of this possibility, I felt it only fair to act as devil's advocate, as Samuel Morrison did years ago. Someone preparing to disembark over the high gunwale of a boat onto Plymouth's shelving, oozy shore, having the memories of that unpleasant dunking that they had suffered wading ashore at Cape Cod, would welcome a chance to avoid such a repetition. The solitary flattish rock at the water's edge could have admirably served such a purpose.
Very good. That is a clear picture of how they might have left the shallop and mounted onto the rock. You also write in this book that the Plymouth Rock has meant many things to its beholders over the last several centuries. Moving forward from this quadricentennial commemoration, how would you want Americans to view this symbolic memorial?
Well, Plymouth Rock was christened in 1741 as a tangible memorial of the founding of Plymouth Colony and the inspirational ordeal of the Plymouth Pilgrims. It was widely celebrated as the cornerstone of the American Union and lauded in sermons, oratory, history, and art. However, any symbol that achieves such prominence also becomes an obvious target for those who resent and protest what it represents. Prevailing contrarian fashion denigrating anything previously honored has recast Plymouth Rock as the emblem of all the nation's faults instead of its virtues, as it once did. Now, this is understandable, but regrettable, as the Pilgrims are by no means an example of the worst tendencies in American history. We have grown beyond having any single icon honoring what is most commendable in our history. But Plymouth Rock deserves a share in the representation that what we esteem in our national heritage.
It certainly does. It's represented in so much literature and music. It's a very notable symbol for people around this country. Now, how do you believe the significance of Plymouth Rock can be enhanced for future generations?
That's difficult to answer.
Uh-huh.
It must first be acknowledged that Plymouth Boulder has no intrinsic virtue. Its significance has been symbolically imposed upon it. What we're really trying to do is maintain an ideal that helped unify a developing nation at a time when divisive narratives like those today were threatening to tear the country apart. Recognizing the vital importance of finding value in tradition rather than simply debunking it is a goal in which Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrim story could play a necessary corrective to a culture of negativity. How that could be accomplished, I cannot say. I have no idea.
Very good. Well, I love that you call it Plymouth Boulder. That that's a new one for me. Jim, I could talk to you about this history all day, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Plymouth 400 Conversations.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for Plymouth 400 Conversations as well. Special thanks to our sponsors and guests who have made this series possible, and thanks to our partner at PAC TV and the Center for Active Living in Plymouth. For more information about this book or how to view past episodes, please visit our website, plymouth400inc.org. Until next time, go make some history.